The night of the full moon festival always carried a particular scent: resin burning in the stone torches, damp wood from the surrounding forest, and the unmistakable aroma of wolves gathered together. Wet earth, warm fur, the faint metallic edge of blood running beneath every pack's skin. Josie had known that scent since childhood, but tonight it felt sharper, as if the air itself understood something important was about to happen. She smoothed the hem of her dress for the third time. It was a simple gown, the color of aged ivory, sewn by her mother's own hands before she died. Every stitch made with a patience Josie only came to understand later, after she was left alone in the world and had to learn to mend her own hems. It was not a noble's dress. It had no silver embroidery, no golden thread like the daughters of Alphas wore. But to Josie, it was the most precious thing she owned, and wearing it tonight felt like an act of quiet courage. The hall of packs was full. Banners hung from the stone columns bearing the crests of the oldest families: the silver wolf of House Ashworth, the black raven of House Draven, the open-clawed bear of House Fenric. Long tables stretched across the center of the hall, heavy with red wine and roasted meat, and the sound of laughter mixed with the crackle of torches. Josie stood near the entrance, hands clasped tightly together, heart pounding. Callum had promised. In front of the whole pack, at the last full moon, he had said that tonight he would claim her as his mate. She was no one, an Omega with no lineage, daughter of nobody, raised at the edge of the forest by a woman who had no status either. But Callum had looked into her eyes and promised. She repeated that promise silently, like a small prayer, as she moved slowly through the crowd of guests. That was when she saw him, at the center of the hall, standing beside his father, Alpha Weston, head of House Ashworth. Callum wore a dark blue cloak, richly embroidered, and beside him stood Isolde, daughter of Alpha Draven, the kind of match that would bind two powerful packs together. Silence fell over the hall as Alpha Weston raised his hand. "Tonight," he announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "my son Callum will be bonded to Isolde Draven, a union that will strengthen our packs for generations to come." Josie felt the floor drop away beneath her feet. No, it couldn't be. She looked at Callum, waiting for him to say something, to correct it, to at least glance her way. But he didn't look. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, chin lifted, like a man who had already decided to forget. The murmurs started low, then grew. A few heads turned toward Josie, still standing near the entrance in the dress her dead mother had sewn, waiting for a promise that had just been shattered in front of the entire pack. Did she really think he'd choose her? Someone whispered. A nameless Omega, imagine that. Josie felt her face burn. Not with shame exactly, but with something colder, the particular humiliation of being seen. She wanted to run. Every instinct told her to turn and disappear into the night before the tears came. But she made herself stand still for one more breath, and then another, refusing to let her spine bend in front of people who had already decided what she was worth. She would not beg. She would not make a scene. Whatever Callum had taken from her, he would not also take her dignity. With as much composure as she could gather, Josie turned and began walking toward the great doors at the back of the hall, her steps measured, her chin level. The whispers followed her like smoke, but she did not let them touch her face. Somewhere behind her, she heard Isolde's soft, satisfied laugh, and she quickened her pace just slightly, just enough to reach the cold night air before anything inside her broke. She never made it to the doors. A presence stopped her. Not a hand, not a word, just the sudden shift in the air of the hall, the way a room changes when something powerful enters it. Josie halted mid-step, and around her, the noise of the hall dimmed as if someone had drawn a curtain over it. 3 men stood near the western entrance, and every wolf in the hall seemed to feel them at once. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp grin and eyes that moved over the room like he was already amused by everyone in it. He wore no house colors, only dark leather and a wolf-tooth pendant that marked him as someone who answered to no one but himself. The second was leaner, dressed with careless elegance, a half-smile playing at his mouth as though the whole gathering were a joke only he understood. His eyes found Josie almost immediately, and something flickered there. Curiosity, maybe amusement, maybe something else entirely. But it was the third man who made the air itself go still. He was silent. He didn't need to announce himself. He simply stood there, dark hair pulled back, a fur-lined cloak resting over broad shoulders scarred faintly along one side of his face. Old wounds, the marks of battles that had made him what he was. His eyes were pale, almost silver, and when they moved through the crowd, people stepped back without seeming to notice they were doing it. Josie recognized him the way everyone in the hall did, though she had never stood this close to him before. Tristan, the Alpha King, not the ruler of a single pack, but the sovereign of the Northern Pack's council, a man whose name alone could silence a room full of wolves twice his rank. He rarely attended gatherings like this. His presence tonight had already sent a ripple of unease through the crowd before Josie had even noticed him. And now, his eyes were on her. Not with pity. Not with the cruel curiosity of someone watching a scandal unfold. Something else. Sharp. Focused. Almost startled, as if he had caught the scent of something he hadn't expected to find in that hall. Josie's breath caught. She had been humiliated in front of everyone only moments ago, and now 3 of the most powerful wolves in the region were looking at her as though she were the only person in the room worth seeing. "Interesting," murmured the leaner one, tilting his head toward her, his voice pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The Ashworth boy just made a very foolish mistake." The broad-shouldered one laughed under his breath. "Foolish doesn't begin to cover it." But Tristan said nothing at all. He simply watched her, and Josie felt that gaze more than she heard the words around her. Felt it settle over her skin like warmth after a long cold. Felt it ask a question no one had bothered to ask her in years. Who are you, really? She didn't know how to answer that. She barely knew herself. Alpha Weston's voice cut through the moment, sharp and displeased. "My king," he said, bowing stiffly toward Tristan. "We did not expect the council to honor us with your presence tonight." Tristan's gaze finally left Josie, though it seemed to take effort. "I heard there would be a bonding ceremony," he said, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the silent hall. "I find I am no longer interested in celebrating it." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Callum, still standing at the front beside Isolde, had gone pale. Tristan took a step forward, and though he addressed no one directly, every wolf in the hall understood the weight behind his next words. "There is a scent in this room," he said slowly, "that I have not smelled in a very long time. Something old. Something the council has been searching for." His eyes moved back to Josie, and this time he did not look away. "It seems the girl your son abandoned may be worth more than your entire alliance, Alpha Weston." The silence that followed was absolute. Josie stood frozen, the humiliation of moments ago now tangled with something new. Confusion, disbelief, the dizzying sense that the ground beneath her had shifted twice in the span of a single hour. She did not understand what Tristan meant. She did not understand why his eyes lingered on her the way they did, as though she were a puzzle he intended to solve. She only knew that for the first time in her life, someone powerful had looked at her and seen something worth keeping, and that terrified her almost as much as it moved her. For a long moment, no one in the hall moved. Josie could feel every eye shifting between her and the Alpha King, and she understood, with a kind of sick clarity, that whatever had just happened could not be undone. She had come to this festival hoping to be claimed by one man. She was leaving it having been noticed by another, one whose word could reshape the fate of entire packs. Alpha Weston's face had gone rigid, the color draining from it, and then rushing back as anger. "My king," he said carefully. "Surely you jest. The girl is an Omega without lineage. Whatever scent you believe you've caught, it cannot be." "I do not jest." Tristan's voice was quiet, but it carried the particular stillness of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "I have hunted that scent across 3 territories. I did not expect to find its source standing in your hall, Weston, discarded like something unwanted." Isolde's hand tightened on Callum's arm. Callum himself looked as though he wished the stone floor would open and swallow him. He would not meet Josie's eyes now. Not out of guilt, she realized, but out of fear. Fear of what the Alpha King's attention might mean for him. Josie's instinct was to shrink, to disappear into the crowd the way she always had. But something in her refused to move. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the humiliation of the last few minutes finally curdling into something sturdier. Whatever it was, she lifted her chin, and for the first time since entering the hall, spoke. "I don't know what scent you mean," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am no one important. You should not trouble yourself on my account, my king." A flicker of something crossed Tristan's face, surprise perhaps, that she had spoken at all, or that she had spoken without trembling. The broad-shouldered man beside him let out a low chuckle. "She has spine," he said, sounding delighted. "Rare in this hall." The leaner man studied her with open interest now, his earlier amusement sharpening into something more deliberate. "Careful, little Omega. My brother does not chase scents for sport. If he says he's been hunting yours, he means it. Brother." Josie glanced between the 3 men and understood, belatedly, that they were not simply allies but kin, the sons, perhaps, of some other great house, bound to Tristan by blood as well as loyalty. Tristan took another step toward her, slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished. She did not. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, the scarred line along his jaw, the quiet control radiating from him like heat from a hearth. And beneath the leather and fur and old battle marks, she caught it. A scent like pine after rain, like something ancient and clean. It should have frightened her. Instead, some small, foolish part of her wanted to lean into it. "You carry a mark," Tristan said, quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "Beneath your collar on the left side, a birthmark shaped like a crescent." Josie's hand flew to her collarbone without thinking. She had that mark. She had always had it, hidden beneath her clothes, a strange pale crescent that her mother used to trace with her thumb and call a promise from your grandmother's line. Josie had never known what that meant. Her mother had died before explaining. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. "Because it is the mark of a bloodline the council believed extinguished a generation ago," Tristan said. "A line of Omegas who could bind packs together not through politics, but through the oldest magic our kind ever possessed. I did not expect to find its last daughter serving wine at the edge of someone else's celebration." The hall erupted into murmurs again, louder this time, disbelief warring with the sudden recalculation happening behind 100 pairs of eyes. Josie could feel the shift. The way people who had sneered at her 20 minutes ago were now looking at her as though seeing her for the first time. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt strange and hollow, because none of them had changed. Only what they thought she was worth had changed. Alpha Weston's jaw worked silently, calculating. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then perhaps a new arrangement?" "Do not," Tristan said, and though his voice did not rise, the temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Your son had his chance. He chose to humiliate her in front of his entire pack rather than honor a promise. That decision was made. It will not be unmade because the council has taken an interest. Callum flinched as though struck. Isolde's grip on his arm loosened, her expression shifting from triumph to something far more calculating. Reassessing, Josie suspected, whether the man beside her was still worth having now that his family's position had grown so precarious. Josie felt dizzy. Too much had happened too quickly. The broken promise, the public shame, and now this. A king she had never spoken to before tonight, claiming to know things about her own blood that she herself did not know. "I don't understand any of this," she admitted, quieter now, some of her composure cracking at the edges. "An hour ago I was nobody. Now you're speaking of bloodlines and magic as though I'm someone from a story." Something in Tristan's expression softened, just slightly, the first crack in his otherwise unreadable calm. "You were never nobody," he said. "You were only unseen. There is a difference, though I understand why it might not feel that way tonight." The broad-shouldered brother, Josie would later learn his name was Rowan, stepped forward with an easy grin, breaking the tension the way a man used to diffusing his sibling's seriousness might. "What my brother means, in his very somber way, is that you've had a terrible night, and it's about to get significantly less terrible. That's usually how it goes with him." The leaner brother Ansel inclined his head toward her with theatrical courtesy. "Welcome to the single most awkward introduction in council history. I promise we're not always this dramatic." Despite everything, despite the humiliation still burning beneath her skin, Josie felt the corner of her mouth twitch. The first almost smile she'd managed all night. It startled her. How easily these strangers had shifted the air around her. How the crushing weight of the hall's judgment seemed to matter less with them standing beside her. Tristan did not smile, but something in his pale eyes eased when he saw hers do. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," he said. "You do not owe this hall an explanation, and you certainly do not owe it your presence a moment longer than you wish to give it. But I would ask, with your permission, to have the council's healers examine the mark, to confirm what I already believe to be true. And after that, whatever you choose to do, I will see that you are never again treated the way you were treated in this room tonight." It was not a command. She noted that carefully. He had asked, not ordered, in a hall full of people who would have obeyed his slightest word without question. That restraint, more than anything else he'd said, was what finally loosened the knot in her chest. "And if I refuse?" she asked, testing, not out of defiance, but out of a need to know the shape of the choice being offered. "Then I will escort you safely from this hall, see you settled somewhere warm, and trouble you no further," Tristan said simply. "The mark does not obligate you to me. Nothing does." Josie looked past him, at the sea of faces still watching. Callum's shame, Isolde's calculation, the pack members who had whispered cruelties only minutes before now straining to catch every word. And she looked at her own hands, roughened from years of chopping wood and mending fences at the edge of a forest that had never truly wanted her. "I would like to leave this hall," she said finally. "Whatever comes after, I don't know yet. But I don't want to spend one more minute standing where I was humiliated." Tristan nodded, as though this were the only sensible answer in the world. He extended his arm, not touching her, simply offering a small, deliberate gesture of choice rather than claim. "Then allow me." Josie hesitated only a moment before placing her hand lightly at his elbow. As they turned toward the doors together, the hall parted around them in silence, and she felt for the first time since her mother died the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being protected, rather than pitied. Behind them, she heard Alpha Weston attempting to salvage something from the wreckage of the evening, his voice pitched toward apology and negotiation both. Tristan did not look back. Neither, she found, did she. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow from the northern mountains. Rowan and Ansel fell into step a respectful distance behind, still bantering quietly between themselves. And for the first time all evening, Josie allowed herself to breathe fully. "Where will you take me?" she asked, glancing sideways at Tristan as they crossed the frost-covered courtyard. "Wherever you wish," he said. "Though I suspect, for tonight, that somewhere warm and far from that hall would serve you best." He paused, studying her profile in the moonlight with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, I would like to show you something. A place at the edge of my territory that has stood empty for a long time. I think it may matter to you more than you realize." Josie didn't know what he meant. But standing there, in the cold, clean air, with the humiliation of the hall finally falling away behind her like a shedskin, she found she was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, curious about what tomorrow might bring, rather than afraid of it. The place Tristan had spoken of was not what Josie had expected. She had imagined something grand, a council chamber perhaps, or a ceremonial site surrounded by stone markers and ancient carvings, the kind of place that announced its importance the moment you laid eyes on it. Instead, after half a day's ride through the northern forest, where the pines grew so tall and close that the sky became a narrow ribbon of pale gray above their heads, Tristan brought her to a cabin. It sat in a small clearing at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by birch trees, whose white bark gleamed faintly in the winter light. It was not large. The walls were made of dark timber, and the roof had partially collapsed on one side, weighed down by years of snow and neglect. The door hung at an angle from a single remaining hinge, and through the gaps in the boards, cold air moved freely, as though the structure itself had long since given up the idea of keeping anything warm. Ice had crept along the base of the walls and up the window frames. Dead vines, stiff with frost, clung to the northern side. Whoever had lived here had been gone for a very long time. Josie stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "This is what you wanted to show me," she said at last. It was not a question. "Yes." Tristan stood beside her, his breath clouding faintly in the cold air. "It's in ruins." "It is." She glanced at him sideways. Most men who want to impress a woman do not begin by showing her a collapsed roof. Behind them, Rowan muffled a laugh badly. Ansel made no attempt to muffle his at all. Tristan, to his credit, allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "I'm not trying to impress you," he said. "I'm trying to show you the truth. This cabin belonged to your grandmother, Josie. She built it herself, 70 years ago, when the council granted her the use of this land. She lived here for 30 years before the last great pack war drove her away. She never came back." Josie's breath stilled. "My grandmother. Her name was Mira. She was the last known carrier of the binding gift before you." He paused, watching her face carefully. "The council has been searching for her line ever since the war ended. We believed it had been lost entirely, that she had died without passing on the bloodline. Your mother must have hidden you, and hidden herself, very carefully for a very long time." Josie took a slow step toward the cabin, then another, until she stood at the threshold. Up close, she could see the details her mother had described in passing, so casually that Josie had never recognized them for what they were. The particular way the doorframe had been carved with small running wolves at the base, worn smooth now by weather and time, but still visible if you looked closely. A hook beside the door where a lantern would have hung. The remnants of an herb garden frozen beneath the snow at the eastern wall. She could see the dried stalks poking through the crust of ice, lavender and yarrow, and something she didn't recognize. She pressed her palm flat against the doorframe, over one of the carved wolves, and felt something she had no name for, a kind of recognition that lived below thought, below language, in some older part of her that had spent 23 years not knowing what it was waiting for. "She was happy here," Josie said, without fully understanding how she knew it. "The council records suggest she was," Tristan said, quietly, from behind her. "She was also formidable. She brokered peace between 4 packs at a time when peace seemed impossible. Not through force, through something the old records call the anchor. An ability to make wolves of different bloodlines feel, in her presence, that they were kin rather than rivals." Josie lowered her hand from the doorframe and turned to look at him. "And you think I have this?" "I know you do." His voice carried no doubt. "The moment I entered that hall last night, I caught your scent across a room full of 200 wolves. I have met every significant Omega and Alpha on this continent, Josie. I have never felt anything like it. Neither had Rowan or Ansel, and they are considerably harder to impress than I am." "Exceptionally hard," Ansel confirmed, leaning against a birch tree with his arms crossed. "I once watched Rowan argue with a war general for 3 hours without blinking. Your arrival last night made him go genuinely speechless for the first time in recorded history." Rowan pointed at his brother without looking at him. "Do not make me sound sentimental." You teared up slightly. "I had something in my eye." Despite herself, despite the overwhelming weight of everything she was being told, Josie smiled. A real one this time. Not the brittle, almost smile from the night before. There was something about Tristan's brothers that made the impossible feel survivable. The way good fire made even the deepest cold manageable. She turned back to the cabin. "What do you want from me?" she asked, directing the question at Tristan, because he was the one she needed to understand. Truly. Not what the council wants, not what the bloodline means politically. What do you want? He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him, expecting evasion. Instead, she found him watching her with that same direct, unguarded focus she had felt in the hall, the kind of attention that had nothing calculated about it. "I want to know if you would consider staying," he said. "Not in the hall, not at the council seat, not anywhere you don't choose freely. But here, if you were willing. This land still belongs to the council, and by blood it should belong to you. I would have it restored, properly with your direction, if you wanted it." Josie looked at the ruined cabin, at the frozen garden, at the lake beyond, its surface white and still, surrounded by the dark line of the forest. Somewhere under the ice, she thought, the water was still moving. It didn't stop just because winter came. It only went quiet and waited. "And what would I do here?" she asked. "Whatever you wished," Tristan said, "though I suspect, knowing what little I do of you, that you would not stay idle for long." He moved to stand beside her at the threshold, looking at the ruin with her rather than at her, and something in that small shift felt significant. "The northern packs are not at war," he continued, "but they are not at peace either. There is a tension that has been building for 3 seasons. 4 pack leaders who cannot speak to one another without reaching for their weapons. I have used every political tool available to me, and the ground has barely moved." Josie understood then, with a clarity that arrived all at once. "You think I can do what she did, what my grandmother did. I think," he said carefully, "that you are capable of far more than anyone in last night's hall understood, including perhaps yourself." She should have felt used. She had spent the last few years learning to be suspicious of people who suddenly found her valuable once they understood what she might be worth to them. But standing beside Tristan in the cold morning light, she found she could not summon the suspicion she expected, because everything he had said had been preceded by "whatever you wish, and if you choose, and with your permission." He had not asked her to be useful. He had shown her something that belonged to her by blood, and asked if she wanted to come home to it. Those were not the words of a man who intended to use her. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath dissolve into the cold air. "I would need help," she said finally. "The roof alone?" "We brought tools," Rowan said immediately, straightening from where he'd been leaning against the birch. His grin spread wide and entirely too pleased with itself. "And timber." and 3 of the council's best builders, who have been waiting very patiently at the tree line for the last 20 minutes because someone— He looked at Tristan, insisted on having this conversation first. Josie turned to look toward the tree line and saw, indeed, 3 figures standing at a respectful distance with supplies, their breath visible in small clouds in the cold morning air. "You were very confident I'd say yes," she said to Tristan. "No," he said, and he sounded entirely sincere. "I was prepared in case you did. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar along his jaw, at the pale gray of his eyes in the winter light, at the way he stood, not commanding the space the way powerful men so often did, pressing the air out of a room with their presence, but simply occupying it, still and solid as a mountain that had no need to announce itself. She looked back at the cabin, at the carved wolves on the doorframe, at her grandmother's frozen garden. "Tell the builders," Josie said, "that we'll start with the roof." Rowan let out a sound that was dangerously close to a cheer. Ansel straightened his cloak with elaborate dignity, as though he had not been hoping for exactly this outcome. And Tristan, quietly, without fanfare, gave a single nod, the way a man does when something he has wanted for a long time finally begins to move in the right direction. Josie stepped over the threshold and into her grandmother's cabin for the first time. It was cold inside. Bitterly, deeply cold. The kind of cold that had settled into the walls over decades. The hearth was choked with old ash and fallen soot. The floorboards were warped. Frost patterned the inside of the single remaining window like lace. But the walls were standing. The foundation was sound, and the hook beside the door, she noticed, was still perfectly shaped to hold a lantern. She stood in the center of the ruined room, alone for a brief moment before the others followed, and breathed it in. Ice, old ash, pine, and beneath it all, something faintly sweet and familiar. Something she could not name, but that felt, inexplicably, like being recognized. "Welcome home," the walls seemed to say, the way old things sometimes speak. Not in words, but in the particular silence they hold when the right person finally walks through the door. The cabin took shape over the following 2 weeks, in a way that felt, to Josie, less like construction and more like resurrection. The builders Tristan had brought were quiet, skilled men who worked without needing direction, but Josie found herself directing them anyway. Not out of authority, which she had never possessed, but out of something more instinctive. A certainty about what the space needed that she couldn't explain, and eventually stopped trying to. The roof went first, new timber fitted over the old bones of the structure, sealed against the northern wind. Then the window frames, replaced and reglazed with thick glass that caught the pale winter light and held it inside the room like something precious. The warped floorboards were lifted and relaid, and the great hearth in the center wall was cleared of decades of ash and restored to working order. On the 3rd evening, Josie lit it for the first time. She knelt before the hearth with flint and tinder, and when the flame caught and spread, and the first real warmth began to breathe into the room, she sat back on her heels and felt something shift inside her chest. Quietly, the way ice shifts when spring first touches it, barely perceptible, but irreversible. Rowan, who had appointed himself the cabin's unofficial general of unnecessary improvements, was currently attempting to hang a new door with more enthusiasm than precision. Ansel sat at the newly restored table, ostensibly reviewing council papers, but primarily offering unhelpful commentary on his brother's carpentry. "It's crooked," Ansel said. "It's rustic," Rowan corrected. "It's crooked and you know it. All the best doors are slightly crooked. It gives them character." Josie glanced at Tristan, who was standing near the window she had asked to be fitted slightly larger than the original. She wanted more light, she had said, and no one had questioned it. He was watching her rather than his brothers, the way she had begun to notice he often did when he thought she wasn't paying attention. It was not an uncomfortable gaze. It was the kind of attention that felt less like being examined and more like being considered, thoughtfully, carefully, the way you study something you do not want to misunderstand. "Your grandmother made the same change," he said, when her eyes met his. "The original plans in the council records show a smaller window. When we found old drawings of the cabin from after she built it, the window was larger. She must have changed it herself." Josie turned to look at the window, at the last gray light of evening filtering through the new glass, catching the frost still rimming the outer edges. "How much do you know about her?" she asked. "About Mira." Tristan moved to stand beside her, looking out at the frozen lake beyond the clearing. The birch trees had taken on a blue tint in the failing light, and the surface of the lake glowed faintly, as though reflecting a sky that was already dark. "Enough to know she was not easy to know," he said. "The council records speak of her abilities, her political work, the peace she brokered. But the men who wrote those records were alphas who found her inconvenient as often as they found her useful. I suspect the true version of her was considerably more interesting than what they wrote down." "She sounds like someone who was reduced to her usefulness by people who didn't bother to understand her," Josie said, and then heard the echo of her own words and went quiet. Tristan heard it too. She could tell by the way his eyes moved to her face. "Yes," he said simply. "I have thought about that." The fire crackled behind them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, standing side by side at the window while outside the northern dark settled over the forest, and the cold deepened, and the stars, one by one, began to appear above the tree line. "The pack leaders," Josie said at last, pulling herself back from wherever that silence had been taking her. "The 4 who won't speak without reaching for their weapons. Tell me about them." Tristan glanced at her with something that might, on a less contained man, have been surprise. "Now?" "You didn't bring me here only to restore a cabin," she said. "I've understood that from the beginning. I'd rather know what I'm actually being asked to do than pretend it's only about the roof." He was quiet for a moment, and then he pulled a chair from the table. Rowan had restored 4 of them, all slightly mismatched, which Josie privately found she liked, and sat, and began to talk. The situation was older than it looked, as these things usually were. 3 seasons ago, a disputed stretch of forest between the Fenric, Aldrich, and Corrin pack territories had begun showing signs of something the older wolves called root sickness, a decay that spread through the land itself, killing trees, fouling streams, driving game away. Each pack believed the others were responsible, either through dark ritual or deliberate poisoning. Blood had been shed at the borders. 2 young wolves were dead. 3 elders had broken the ancient accord of shared ground by refusing to attend council. The 4th leader, Alpha Reed of the Northmark pack, had historically been a neutral voice, a mediator of sorts. But 3 months ago, his daughter had been found at the edge of the disputed forest, ill with something the healers could not name, and now Reed no longer wished to mediate. He wished to burn the other 3 territories to the ground. Josie listened to all of it without interrupting. When Tristan finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire. "The sickness in the land," she said finally. "Has anyone gone into the disputed forest itself? Not to guard a border, not to accuse anyone. Just to look?" Tristan frowned, very slightly. "It would be considered a provocation by whichever pack. By someone neutral, I mean." She looked at him. "By someone none of them have reason to distrust." He studied her. "You're suggesting yourself." "I'm asking whether it's possible. You said my grandmother brokered peace not through force, but through presence. I don't think she did that by sitting in a room and waiting for the right people to come to her. I think she walked into the places no one else would go." Josie paused. "I've been walking into places no one else wanted to bother with my whole life. I suspect I'm reasonably good at it." Something shifted in Tristan's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a deepening of that focused attention, as though she had confirmed something he had been carefully hoping for. "It would not be without risk," he said. "I know. The border patrols are unpredictable. If a pack scout found you in the disputed forest alone—" "Then I would not go alone," Josie said. "I would go with someone the packs recognize and respect." She held his gaze steadily. "Someone whose presence signals that the council itself is paying attention." The fire popped behind her. Rowan had gone very still near the door he'd been hanging, which was now, Josie noticed, perfectly level. He had apparently been capable of straight carpentry the entire time, and had simply been performing incompetence to have an excuse to stay within earshot of the conversation. Ansel had set down his papers entirely. Tristan looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said, "You would need a cloak with council markings. And you should eat something substantial tonight, because if we leave at first light, the ride will be cold." Josie exhaled slowly. "Is that a yes?" "It is," he said. And then, quietly, with the particular weight of a man choosing his words with care, "It is also the first time in 3 seasons anyone has suggested something that doesn't involve either political pressure or drawn weapons. I find that I am very glad you came through that door." She didn't know which door he meant, her grandmother's cabin door, or the door of the festival hall where he had first seen her. Perhaps both. Perhaps they were. In some sense, she was still learning to understand. The same door. That night, after the builders had retired to their camp at the forest edge, and Rowan and Ansel had settled near the fire, with the particular boneless ease of large men who are comfortable anywhere, Josie sat at the window of her grandmother's restored cabin and looked out at the frozen lake. A friend from her old life, a woman named Petra, who had known Josie since they were both young and uncertain and living at the margins of a pack that barely tolerated them, had pressed a small carved token into her hand before she left the festival. A running wolf, rough cut from pale wood, small enough to fit in a closed fist. "So you remember where you came from," Petra had said. "Even when everything changes." Josie held it now, turning it over in her fingers. She could feel the warmth of the cabin behind her. The fire Tristan had fed quietly and without ceremony an hour ago, adding a log without being asked because the night had grown colder, and he had noticed before she had. Small things. She was learning that he communicated in small things. In attention rather than declaration. In action rather than announcement. She thought about Callum, who had promised loudly and delivered nothing. She thought about Tristan, who had promised nothing and had been quietly delivering since the moment they met. The lake lay still and silver beyond the glass. The forest was dark and full of things she did not yet understand, and in the morning she would ride into a disputed territory with a king who had chosen her company, not because she was useful, but because he had seen something in her worth standing beside. She closed her hand around the carved wolf and held it tightly for a moment. Then she set it on the window ledge, where it would catch the morning light, and went to rest before the long ride ahead. They rode out before dawn, when the forest was still dark, and the only light came from the stars above the tree line and the faint blue glow of snow underfoot. Tristan rode beside her, Rowan and Ansel a measured distance behind, and 4 council riders further back still, present enough to signal authority, distant enough not to crowd whatever needed to happen when they arrived. Josie had not asked how long the ride would take. She had learned, in the 2 weeks of restoring the cabin, that Tristan did not offer information unnecessarily, and did not withhold it either. He told her what she needed when she needed it, and trusted her to ask for the rest. It was a remarkably comfortable way to be treated by someone powerful, and she was still getting used to it. The disputed forest appeared gradually, the way difficult things often do, not as a sudden wall, but as a slow change in the quality of the trees around them. The pines grew darker, their bark stained with something gray-black that spread upward from the roots like ink soaking through cloth. The undergrowth thinned. The snow between the trees was unmarked by animal tracks, which meant the game had moved away, which meant the sickness was real, and not a story any pack had invented to justify their grievances. Josie dismounted at the edge of the affected area without being asked. "Stay with the horses," she said to Rowan, who looked as though he wanted to object, and then, reading something in her expression, did not. She looked at Tristan. He dismounted as well, without a word, and fell into step beside her as she walked into the darkened forest. Up close, the sickness had a scent. Not rotting exactly, but deeply wrong. The way a note played slightly off-key is wrong. Something the body recognizes before the mind does. Josie moved slowly, touching nothing, only looking. She crouched beside a root where the black stain was densest and studied it for a long moment. "It's not poison," she said. "Or not the kind you choose to spread. Look at the pattern. It radiates outward from a central point. If someone had done this deliberately, you'd see it moving along borders, concentrated where packs meet. This is coming from one place." Tristan crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold morning air. "The old records mention something called a grief wound," he said slowly. "A place where violence was so concentrated that the land itself retained it, like a scar that never healed." "Something happened here," Josie said. "Something old, before the packs started blaming each other." She stood and looked deeper into the forest, following the pattern with her eyes. "There's a center. I want to find it." They walked for nearly an hour through the silent, darkened trees, following the deepening stain. Josie was aware of Tristan beside her the entire time. Not crowding her, not guiding her, only present. She had stopped finding that presence unsettling 2 weeks ago, and had started finding it something she noticed when it was absent. The center was a clearing. Small, perfectly circular, as though the trees had stepped back deliberately. At its heart was the remnant of a structure. Not a cabin like her grandmother's, but something older. A ring of stones that had once been a ceremonial fire circle, now cracked and scattered. And in the soil at the center, exposed where frost had heaved the earth upward, was the unmistakable dark iron of an old weapon. A spear tip, corroded with age, driven into the ground and left. "Someone was killed here," Josie said quietly. "A long time ago. And no one ever came back to mark it properly, or grieve it, or close the wound." She did not fully understand what happened next. She would try to explain it afterward and find that language was insufficient. She only knew that she walked to the center of the clearing, knelt beside the broken fire circle, and placed both palms flat on the frozen earth, and felt the grief wound the way you feel a deep cold. Not on the surface, but all the way through. Bone deep, old and patient, and exhausted with waiting. She did not have words for what she did. She only stayed present with it, the way her mother had taught her to sit with hard things without flinching from them. She breathed slowly. She let the grief be real without letting it consume her. And gradually, so gradually she could not have said when it began, the quality of the air in the clearing changed. The cold remained, but something else arrived beneath it. A stillness that was different from the dead stillness of the corrupted trees. A stillness that was simply quiet rather than wrong. As if the place had exhaled for the first time in a very long time. When Josie finally lifted her hands from the earth and stood, the stain at the center of the clearing had faded by half. Not gone, but quieted, the way pain quiets when it is finally witnessed by someone willing to bear it. Tristan was standing at the edge of the clearing. She did not know how long he had been watching. His expression was not the expression of a man seeing a political asset perform a useful function. It was something older and more unguarded than that. The face of someone who has been searching for a long time and has finally, unexpectedly, arrived. It will need more than one visit, Josie said, her voice slightly rough. But it's not permanent. It can be healed. And when it is, there will be nothing left for the packs to fight over. The land will be clean, and the sickness will be gone, and the story they've been telling each other about blame and guilt will have no ground to stand on. Tristan crossed the clearing to her in a few quiet strides. He said nothing for a moment, only stood close, studying her face with that careful, unhurried attention. Then he reached out, and very gently, brushed a smear of dark earth from her cheekbone with his thumb. A brief, quiet touch. Nothing more. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was such a simple question. After everything, after the grief wound and the corrupted land and the weight of something ancient passing through her, it was such a human, careful question, and it undid her more completely than anything else could have. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." They brought the 4 pack leaders to the clearing 3 days later. It was Josie's idea to bring them together rather than separately, and Tristan had backed her without qualification when his advisors objected. She stood at the center of the fire circle as the 4 alphas arrived: Fenric, Aldrich, Corin, and Reed, each accompanied by 2 lieutenants, all of them bristling with suspicion and old anger. She did not speak first. She let them stand in the clearing and feel it. The same thing she had felt. The deep wrongness beneath the soil. The grief that had been waiting. She gave them time to understand that what they were standing in was not the result of each other's treachery, but of something that had been wounded long before any of them were born. Then she spoke. Not with power, or political language or threat. She told them what she had found. She told them what the land remembered. She told them about the grief wound and what it had taken from all of them. The game, the clean water, the 2 young wolves whose deaths had come from fear and misunderstanding in a place that was already poisoned. Alpha Reed, whose daughter had been ill at the forest's edge, sat down heavily on one of the old stones before she was halfway through. By the time she finished, his head was bowed. "My daughter touched the earth here," he said very quietly. "I thought someone had cursed her. The land touched her," Josie said gently. It was asking for help the only way it could. It was not one conversation that resolved everything. It never is. But it was the first conversation in 3 seasons that ended without anyone reaching for a weapon. By the time the 4 alphas rode away from the clearing, they had agreed to meet again under council auspices, and Alpha Reed had clasped the hand of Alpha Fenric for the first time in 2 years. Tristan stood beside Josie as the last of them disappeared into the trees. "You told me you were no one important," he said. Josie exhaled, exhausted and lighter than she had felt in years. "I think I was wrong about that." "You were," he agreed. And then, because he was a man who chose his moments carefully, "I would like to tell you something." She looked at him. "I came to that festival because one of my scouts reported an unusual scent moving through Ashworth territory," he said. "That part was true, but the moment I entered the hall and saw you standing at the door in that dress, trying to hold yourself together while an entire room watched you be humiliated." He paused, the way he always did when he was being precise. "I did not walk toward you because of the bloodline. I walked toward you because I could not imagine walking away." Josie was quiet for a moment. "That," she said carefully, "is the most words I have ever heard you say at one time." Something genuinely warm moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close, the closest she had seen. "I'm aware. I thought the occasion merited it." She looked at him, at the scar along his jaw, the pale eyes that had watched her so carefully from the very beginning, the stillness that was not coldness, but something else entirely, something she now knew the shape of. She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who looked slowly and saw truly. She thought about the cabin, warm and lit, waiting for her at the edge of the frozen lake. She reached out and took his hand, unhurried, deliberate, a choice rather than an impulse. "Then stay," she said simply. "Not for the council, and not for the bloodline. Just stay." His hand closed around hers and he said, "Yes." The disputed forest healed over the course of the following season. Josie returned to the clearing 7 more times, and each time the stain receded further until the morning she arrived, and the earth was simply earth again, cold and clean, and the first green shoots of new growth were pushing through the frost at the base of the old stone circle. She knelt and touched them, and felt nothing but life. The 4 packs signed a new accord of shared ground before the thaw came. Alpha Reed's daughter recovered fully, and Reed himself became one of the Accord's most committed voices, as men sometimes do when they have been given back something they feared was lost forever. Callum Ashworth and Isolde Draven were bonded as planned, and their alliance brought exactly the political convenience it was designed to bring, and nothing more. Josie did not think of him often. When she did, it was without bitterness, only with the clear, settled understanding that some losses are not losses at all, only doors opening onto something truer. Petra came to stay at the cabin in the spring, and Josie gave her the eastern room and the use of the herb garden, which by then had been coaxed back to life from the frozen stalks. Lavender and yarrow, and the third plant Josie had eventually identified from her grandmother's notes as a rare northern sage, used for warding and warmth. Rowan visited constantly and without invitation, which everyone pretended to find inconvenient, and no one actually did. Ansel came less often, but always at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right remark to break whatever tension had accumulated, as though he kept his own private schedule of when to appear and when to stay away. On a morning in late spring, with the lake finally thawed and the birch trees full of new leaves, Tristan stood at the window Josie had made larger, the same window her grandmother had made larger before her, and watched the light move across the water. Josie came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, looking out at the lake they had both come to think of as theirs. "Do you think she knew?" Josie asked. "My grandmother. That someone would come back here eventually." Tristan considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. "I think she built the hook for the lantern knowing the cabin might be dark for a long time before anyone lit it again," he said. "I think that is a particular kind of faith." Josie looked at the hook beside the door. A lantern hung there now, one she had chosen herself, brass and glass, lit every evening against the northern dark. "I think you're right," she said. She slipped her hand into his, and he held it, and outside the lake gleamed, and the forest breathed, and the land that had been wounded and then healed lay quiet and whole beneath the open sky. It was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. And it was, at last, home.